All right, I'm going to talk about bringing our old computers into the modern world. It's going to be more breadth than depth. I want to cover a lot of different systems, talk about some of the modern upgrades that are available, and so don't expect that I'm going to go too deep into any one system. All right, so I'm primarily a podcaster. I do the Floppy Days podcast. I am the host of that podcast. I have 135 episodes so far, and hit 11 years this month with that podcast. So I also do the Antique podcast, which is just about Atari 8-bit computers, where Floppy Days covers all computers, and we just talk about the Atari 8-bit news, and I do that with Brad Arnold and Kay Savitz. We're just about to hit 11 years with that as well. And then I also co-host Next Without 4, which is a podcast about programming vintage computers or using vintage computer languages, like COBOL or Fortran or Pascal. So that's what I do. I'm retired now, so that's spend even more time with podcasting. So what I want to talk about today is, like I said, modern upgrades. There are different categories in my mind of vintage computer enthusiasts. You've got the purists who like the old hardware, like to use all the old floppy drives and the old printers and so on, and enjoy that original experience. And then you've got those who really prefer to do the emulation. They don't want that much hardware. They don't have room for that much hardware. And so they do a lot of they get their fix out of doing emulation on modern machines. And I'm not saying there aren't people who cross all of these. There are. But there's also a mixture that I fall into this category here, where I like the original hardware, especially the computers themselves, but I don't really enjoy some of the challenges that we had with the computers back in the day. The floppy drives, how finicky they were, and the media not always being reliable and that sort of thing. Limited RAM, less than ideal video, those sorts of things. I don't really enjoy those aspects of it. So even though I might own some of those peripherals, I never use those peripherals. So that's what I see as far as the different categories. So I mentioned I enjoy the computers. I don't enjoy a lot of the peripherals as much, but as a result, I really like the modern upgrades. I like the fact that you can take these old computers and bring them into the modern world. You can do networking, you can do better video, you can do SD card-based virtual floppies and virtual hard drives and those sorts of things. It's just a kick to take an old computer from 40 years ago and put it on the internet, or to use an SD card, to get your software, that sort of thing. And so I love talking about those on the podcast. Some platforms have a huge number of modern upgrades available. Other platforms, not so much. I have about 40 platforms in my collection, and the first thing I do when I get a new platform is that I try to acquire at least a better video solution and SD-based or compact flash-based virtual drives, because again, those are the aspects I most do not enjoy using on the old machines. So my main focus is going to be the video, the virtual disk solutions. Sometimes I might get RAM upgrades far beyond what you could have done back in the day. Putting 1 megabyte on an Atari 8-bit or whatever. Sometimes I also branch into other categories such as networking solutions or maybe accelerators, although I'm not really going to talk about those in this particular talk much, just because It's just such a wide topic. I don't really have time to talk about those things. And I haven't really branched into those areas that much as far as acquiring accelerators and those sorts of things. So the goal with this presentation, and I know I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through it, but I'm going to talk about the information I've gathered over the last 11 years in doing the podcast and acquiring and talking about modern upgrades. Again, it's going to be broad, not deep. It's going to cover mainly video solutions and virtual disks. I have 24 platforms I want to cover, so I'm going to be very fast on each one of them. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order so I don't show any favoritism towards any particular platform, even though Atari is probably near and dear to my heart. As far as video solutions, one thing I want to mention, I won't go too deep into these except for certain platforms, because most of the time what I try to do there is get an RGB to SCART cable. So if the computer supports RGB output, it's pretty easy to typically get an RGB to SCART cable and then get a SCART to HDMI adapter, and I have a couple of those, and you can get really great output from your machine. So I'd say most of the machines that I have, that's the way that I've gone. And it's really easy to acquire those. And I know SCART was a European standard, particularly a UK standard, but you can acquire the RGB to SCART cables from a lot of places. So I'm going to start out with the Amstrad CPC. I don't know if a lot of people have an Amstrad. A couple years ago, I got into acquiring some of the machines from other nationalities, and rather than just sticking with the US machines. So the Amstrad CPC 464 is one that I got. There is a virtual disk solution called the M4. It not only has virtual disk capability, but also has networking, particularly Wi-Fi access, and use an SD card for your virtual drives. I also, again, I have a SCART cable for that. Being a European machine, that certainly was a great solution for it. The Apple II lines, I have a 2E, 2GS, and a 2C, so I've got solutions for all those. Different solutions for the different machines. One of which is the Vid HD for my Apple IIe that will give you HDMI output. It's a card that goes in your Apple IIe slot, and you get HDMI output. I don't know if you can still get those. I looked online recently, and it looked like maybe they're a little harder to get now. I don't know if they're still being made or not, because there are other options. Fairly recently, I saw that there are VGA graphics cards now available for the, so you can go with a VGA solution on your Apple IIe. For my Apple IIc, I have an RGB to VGA adapter, so it goes directly from RGB to VGA. And for my 2GS, I have an RGB to SCART cable, and then the SCART to HDMI option. Also on the 2E, 2GS, 2C front, Floppy Emu is a great floppy and hard disk emulator. I bought one probably a year ago, just got it out recently and hooked it up to my 2E. And I know you can also use these on a Macintosh. You have to reflash them if you want to use them on a Macintosh. But that's a great option. And the CFFA 3000 is one that's been out for several years. There used to be separate runs that were made of those, and I got in at that time. And so I've had one of those in my Apple IIe for a long time. And that's a great storage option. Floppy emulator, hard drive emulator. FujiNet. I'll probably talk about this a little more when I get to the Atari front, since that's where it started, but there is a FujiNet available for the Apple II. And it's a great networking solution. Get your Apple on the internet, do virtual disks over the internet, play multiplayer games with your Apple II. And it's a great option. Everyone in here is probably familiar with the FujiNet, are you not? There's a FujiNet exhibit here. You may have heard Tom Cherryholm's talk earlier today, but that is just a wonderful peripheral. The Mac Classic, I have purchased something called the Blue SCSI that you use SD card to get virtual disks on your Mac. I actually have a Mac SE that I use this on, but I believe you can use this on any of the Mac Classic models. The Atari 8-bit, the FujiNet. If you wanted to have one peripheral for your Atari 8-bit, you need the FujiNet. With the SD card as a virtual disk, the ability to get on the internet, virtual disks out there, use BBSs, all that sort of thing. It's just a wonderful peripheral. And I always tell people, if you can only afford one thing, make sure you get the FujiNet. Also, there are lots of options on the Atari 8-bit. I'll try not to dwell on too many of them. There's an S-Drive Max, which looks just like a 1050 drive to the Atari 8-bit. It's micro SD based. It actually has a screen on it, and you can select the file that you want to load from it, or you can do it from the computer itself. But that is a great option, relatively low cost, and a great way to go. There's also SIO to SD down here. So this one is SD card based, and again, it just looks like a floppy drive to your Atari 8-bit. It also has a screen for selecting your files. On the video front, there's SoFIA, which will actually update or upgrade your video so that you can get direct. For me, I get direct VGA out of my Atari 8-bit, which gives a wonderful display. So that's a great way to go. It's very easy to install. There's no soldering required. The only thing you have to do is find a way to get the cable out of the machine so that you can hook it to your monitor. And so I had to make a hole in my case to do that. There's also something called the VBXE, which is another video upgrade you can get for the Atari 8-bit. Am I coming through okay? Can you guys hear me all right? Okay. The Ultima 1 megabyte is a great upgrade for your XL or XE machine, and that will give you larger RAM. It will give you hard disk capability, CF card for a hard disk, 4 different OS ROM slots, and for your XL and XE, it is a great option. It does require opening your machine and installing that, and a little bit of soldering required. I prefer the ones that don't require any soldering, but you can't always, get the upgrade that doesn't require any soldering at all. On the Atari ST, there's the Ultra Satan, which is SD based, and that is a real great option. Seems very, very, very popular. I just got one recently. I haven't been able to actually do a lot with it yet, but that's a great way to go for virtual disk and virtual hard disk. And then for my ST, I use an RGB to HDMI option for color. So I have a cable that actually goes, I'm trying to think, I think it actually is RGB to SCART and then SCART to HDMI. But then for the mono on the ST, I have a cable that goes directly from RGB to VGA. Also on the Atari ST, there are a couple that you may or may not have heard of. One is very recent called the Sidecart, and it basically is a cartridge ROM emulator for the ST. It goes into the cartridge slot, and it will also emulate floppy disks and hard disks. There is something called the STE hard disk made by a gentleman that goes by the handle of Masteries in Spain, and he makes that. It's also a hard disk. It looks like a hard disk to your ST. The BBC Micro, great machine. This was probably the Apple II of Great Britain. Very, very flexible machine. There are a lot of options for the BBC Micro. I have an RGB to SCART option, as you might suspect, because it did have RGB as one of the video out options on it. It's a little unique in that it was built so that you could have coprocessors, and you could have a 6809 coprocessor or another 6502 or a Z80 or whatever as a coprocessor actually on that machine. There is something called the Pi coprocessor board. So you use our Raspberry Pi, and then it will emulate whichever of those coprocessors that you want. And so that's pretty cool. There's also compact flash adapters. It's really easy to add compact flash and use that as a virtual hard drive on your BBC Micro. There are SD interfaces as well if you don't want to use compact flash, which is in itself getting pretty old. And one that's fairly recent called Master SD, which is an SD card interface cartridge for it as well, and that's available on eBay. Coleco Adam. The FujiNet is available there as well. That's the third platform that currently is pretty much fully supported now on FujiNet, or by FujiNet. And so fairly early on, I managed to get a FujiNet for my Coleco Adam. And that's a great way to upgrade capabilities of your Adam. There's also the AdamNet drive emulator. So for virtual drives, it's SD card based. And I managed to get one of these at the same time that I got my FujiNet. And it's really powerful and nice to use on your Coleco Adam instead of using the tape drives or trying to get one of the hard to acquire floppy drives for the Coleco Adam. This is a great way to go. The Commodore Amiga, there are quite a few options there, and far more than just floppy emulators or hard drive emulators, but I'm not really going to talk about those other options. I do have an RGB to SCART cable for it. That works well. Something called the Parcero, which I think is a wonderful upgrade. I have one both for my Amiga 1000 and my Amiga 500. Made by a gentleman by the name of David Dunkley. And it gives either machine 8 meg of RAM. It will give super quick boot up, which is nice for the 1000 because with the 1000, it didn't have the capability to boot kickstart and everything, right off the machine. You had to use it off disk. So with the Parcero, you can get, very, very quick boot up on your Amiga 1000. And then he came along and made one for the Amiga 500 as well. And that is a great way to go. There's also a lesser expensive option called the Amiga SD for virtual disks. Commodore 64. Those of you that are 64 fans know that there are a huge number of modern upgrades available for this platform, and I'm sure you all have your favorites. For me, I have an SD to IEC for virtual disk. It does a pretty good job of emulating a 1541 disk drive. And then the Ultimate 2 Plus, I don't actually have one of these yet, but I understand that this does a much better job actually of emulating the 1541, and that's a great way to go if you want a virtual disk option. Pi 1541 is another way to go if you want to, if you've got a Raspberry Pi that you just want to add a hat to, and it'll emulate a 1541. I have a lot of Pis in my collection, so I tend to get Pi-based things when I can. And then there's also got something called the Tape Card SD, which is a basically for tape software, and putting that on an SD card and then getting that loaded into your Commodore 64. Commodore 128, I do have a RGB to SCART option that I utilize for that, for video. This is actually the RGB to SCART, and then I've got a SCART cable. So it's a little more involved because there's 3 pieces to it. This connects to the computer, then you have a SCART to SCART cable, and then it goes into the SCART to HDMI adapter. Commodore Vic-20, you can use the SD to IEC the same as the Commodore 64 uses. There's also something called the Ultimem from Retro Innovations, Jim Brain's store, that will give you 8 megabytes of programmable flash ROM storage and up to 1 megabyte of RAM storage. And it's fully configurable. There's a lot of different RAM configurations on a VIC-20, and so it will support all of those things. There's also the final expansion. I know there are some other boards as well, but I have the final expansion. It also will expand the main memory by 512K. 512K on a VIC-20, that's just incredible. That originally had, what, 3K or whatever of usable memory. It also acts as a mass storage device. The Hewlett Packard Series 80. I don't know how many of you have these. They're not that common to own those. These were more scientific type machines, very, very expensive in the day. But I do have a Series 80, HP 85 is what I have. And there actually are modern upgrades. I never thought there would be, but there are modern upgrades for that series of machines. There's something called the PRM85. For those of you that know, there's a ROM drawer that you use on the HP. You have different ROMs in it that might have basic or a printer ROM or whatever. So it'll emulate all the different ROMs that you could have on the HP Series 80. And so that's a great one to have. And then there's something that came out a couple years ago called and it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it's called the EBTKS. And it is a virtual, well, they bill it as a virtual tape drive, but it's much, much more than just a virtual tape drive. Developed by Philip Frieden, and it has tape drive emulation. You use a 16 gig SD card, disk drive emulation, RAM, so you can get the full RAM like on an A, which didn't have as much RAM as the HP 85B does. You get extended memory. It'll provide up to 18 ROMs, these ROMs that I mentioned. You can have up to 18 of those in there. It's got a bunch of new basic keywords for using it. So, I mean, it's a wonderful upgrade. And if you have an HP Series 80, you definitely need one of these. PC Junior. The Junior IDE is a great option there. It will give your Junior IDE interface, so you can use a compact flash card as a hard drive. It also gives you the full 1 meg of RAM for your PC Junior, and has flash ROM and a real-time clock. So that's a wonderful upgrade. And then I have a CGA to VGA converter that I use to get the best video that I can out of my PC Junior. Mattel Aquarius. There aren't really what I would call modern upgrades per se, but you can get a album cartridge which has basically all the software ever developed for the Mattel Aquarius on it. And then there's a 32K RAM cartridge for it as well, so you can take it all the way up to 32K. Those of you that may have some of you may have gotten a chance to listen to Sean Harrington's Aquarius Plus talk, I think it was yesterday, where he talks about, you know, the remake that he did, an improvement that he created for the Aquarius. MSX. Just recently got an MSX, and one of the first things that I felt like I needed to get was some sort of SD option, and I found something called the SD Memory Mapper, and it will give it 512K of RAM, as well as 2 SD cards for storage. So that is a great option. Mine's just an MSX1, but this actually will work on, I think, all the different MSX 2 and 3 or 2 plus as well. The Oric Atmos, another one of those European machines. There is something called the Erebus SD interface for that. It acts like a turbo tape drive for the Oric Atmos. Also will work on the Oric, what's the other one? I forget what the earlier Oric was. And then an RGB to SCART cable. You can get that for the Atmos as well. The Sinclair. Quite a few options there. This is the, the earlier Sinclair. So I'm talking about here, the ZX8081, Timex Sinclair 1000 and 1500, which were pretty much compatible with those. So it doesn't have RGB out. About the best you can do is mod those to get composite out on them. I do have a composite mod that I bought. I haven't installed because the video on my Timex Sinclair 1000 and ZX81 actually are just awful, and I really need to put the composite mod in it. I also have a ZX Band Plus. It's probably the most popular virtual drive option. And then you can also even get an upgrade for that, a super serial card to get networking, including Wi-Fi networking. Just connects right to that card itself. Something else that I got, I don't know if you would call it a modern upgrade, but because there were a lot of keyboard options and replacements back in the day. The keyboard on the ZX8081, Timex Sinclair 1000 are terrible. And on Semi-Retro, I was able to get like a fully remade keyboard. It's got a great feel to it, and it's a great way to go if you actually want to do something useful on your ZX8081. You might want to put a better keyboard on it. Now I know those that had a ZX80, they said they got used to the keyboard and it was fine, but I'm not used to the keyboard. The Spectrum, RGB discard, it does have RGB, or at least the later Spectrums had RGB out. So I've got RGB discard for my Spectrum Plus 2 that I have. And something called the Div MMC Future for virtual disk capability. And I think that's probably the most well-known option for virtual disk on the Spectrum. Works great, never had a problem with that. It also has a joystick port on it, so you can connect a joystick, which the original Spectrum didn't have. The Tandy, this in particular, Tandy model 100, 102, and 200. One of the first things I would recommend if you have one of these, any of these three machines, these three models, would be a Rec Sharp, because you can put that into the option ROM slot that's built into these, and it gives you basically several banks, 32K banks, and you can put different software on the different banks and switch to those banks, run the software, and it's just a great way to go. There's also something on the SD virtual disk solution. There's originally something called a NADS box for doing that, which is the one on the left here. And they don't make those anymore, haven't made them for quite some time. I managed to get my hands on one. But then later, Jeff Burt came along and created something called the Backpack, which does essentially the same thing. And that's a great SD card storage solution for the 100 and 102. And then also on the 100 and 102, there is an external VGA solution. I bet you didn't know you could do that on a Model 100, actually put it up on a VGA screen. But there was a DVI called the digital, or what was it called? The Disk Video Interface that Tandy made that would allow you to, it had a disk drive built in. You could also run it into a monitor. But this is just a little bitty board that does the same thing as that gigantic DVI box does. And so you can actually get VGA out on your Model 100 or 102. Tandy Coco, 1, 2, 3, a lot of options there. And I think one of the most popular for SD card or virtual disk solution is the Coco SDC. And I've had one for probably 4 years now. And it's probably the most popular and just pretty easy to use. And there are disk images already created that you can put on this, and it's ready to go. I also, on the monitor front, is something a little bit unusual. The Coco 3, which does output RGB, I got an Apple IIgs monitor adapter. So I have an Apple IIgs monitor. This is one way you can hook your Coco to a good monitor, the Apple IIgs monitor. So it's a little unusual to hook a Coco up to an Apple monitor, but it works and works great. Or you can do an RGB to SCART cable, which I have that option as well. And you can upgrade the RAM internally fairly easily. There's a 512K upgrade offered by Cloud9, and I just recently acquired this. I have not installed it yet. The little Tandy MC10, the little brother to the Coco, I guess you would call it. There are actually options for that, some really nice options. The machine itself is, very small, and it only came with 4K of RAM. I think it was 4K. Yeah, 4. And there's an MCX 32 SD that's available for that, so that you can get 32K of RAM on your MC10, as well as virtual tape, essentially, virtual tape drive. And then something also fairly recently called the PyKey 10, which is actually a riser, includes a riser for your machine, so that there would be room inside for the modification that is done internally to give you USB keyboard capability, as well as joystick, 9-pin Atari joysticks. So I think you can see those on there as the joystick ports, and this is actually an on-off switch here, or a reset. I think that's a reset switch there. So that's the cool. It does require modding your machine, obviously, to get it installed inside and then have the riser on it. Mine's in black and gold for Purdue University, which is my college of choice. So you can make that whatever color you want. That's done by Brendan Donahue. And if you go to Tandy Assembly, you'll meet Brendan. TRS-80 model 1, 3, 4, and 4P. Probably, in my opinion, one of the best options out there is the MIs or the MIs. The MIs for the Model 1, the MIs for the Model 3. It is amazing. You've got 2 compact flash drives for hard drive capability. It's got wired Ethernet. It's got a real-time clock calendar. You get SVGA output. And it's got a joystick for Atari 2600 compatible joysticks. So if you're familiar with the Model 1, it came out in 1977. You couldn't do any of that stuff, back then. And this is just a wonderful upgrade for the TRS-80 Model 1 and 3. The MIs really has the same capability, but for the Model 3. And then there's the Fred, also will emulate a TRS-80 hard drive and use an SD card for storage. I have one of these actually installed in my Model 4, and then I have an external one that I use on my 4P. The TI-99 has several options. One of the first ones that I acquired was CF7, also might be called the NanoPeb. Basically takes that entire PEB box that weighs a ton for the TI-99 and shrinks it down to 1 card. You've got you can get to 32K of RAM on your TI-99. You've got virtual floppy with an with a compact flash card. And then you could get a version that has serial interface as well, or a parallel interface. So it probably weighs, 1/100th of what a PEB weighs, and gives you a lot of the same capability. There's also the Tippy, which is more recent. That's more a networking solution. It does use a Raspberry Pi. I have a Tippy. I've not actually done anything with it yet, but that's a pretty cool modern upgrade for your TI-99. F18A is a video upgrade you can get for the TI-99. VGA output. There is these have been hard to acquire for a while, but there's a new lower cost version either coming out or maybe even might be available now. But you put that in, you get VGA out, and get really nice, crisp, clear video output from your TI-99. And then the final GROM cartridge allow you to run ROM and GROM cartridge images from an SD card. That is extremely popular. And I think, most fans of the TI-99 will acquire one of those. I don't actually have one of those yet. For the Timex Sinclair 2068, never was a really popular machine, especially here in the US, but there are some modern upgrades, and one that just came out very recently I'll talk about here in a minute. But you can get something called the Twister board. The Timex Sinclair 2068 was sort of Spectrum, ZX Spectrum compatible, but not fully. And the expansion port on it was not compatible with the ZX Spectrum. So this Twister board makes it compatible, and then you can use ZX Spectrum upgrades on your Timex Sinclair 2068. It also, at the same time, has an HDMI interface on it so that you can get HDMI out from your Timex Sinclair, which originally had RGB output. And then, as I mentioned just recently, the TS Pico is something that you're just talking weeks ago. It's a Raspberry Pi-based expansion. There actually is, you can get a version where there's a separate expansion board that has 3 slots on it, and then you can get the board version of the TS Pico, put that in. There's still a couple of empty slots on there for other things. But use a micro SD card, and it will emulate a tape drive and let you load tape software off of it. It has some extensions to BASIC that allow you to interact with it, and it's very powerful. Uh-oh, what happened? Was that my last one? Hey, I did pretty good. Okay, that was the last one. So I can open it up for any questions or any comments anybody might want to make at this time. Anybody have any questions? I know I went through it really fast, and as I said, you probably have your own favorite modern upgrades, and I didn't go into a lot of detail on a lot of these things. Yes, sir?
Just in general terms, where's the source to locate a lot of these specialty products?
Oh gosh, that's hard to say, right? Because depending on the platform, it can be a different answer entirely.
You have the slide deck online somewhere?
I don't, but I will make it available online. I'll probably put it, what I thought I'd do is put it on my Floppy Days site and make it available there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Like I said, it comes from 11 years of research doing that podcast, so
Yeah.
I don't mind sharing it.
Just really break down it all in one spot.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.